Good evening, everyone. I hope you're all doing well. My name is Jason Gedek, and I work here at Brookside Gardens, part of Montgomery Parks in Maryland. We really appreciate you being here tonight. We think this is a very important conversation to have around environmental justice and what that means and looks like, and how that affects communities of color. We've assembled a wonderful group of panelists, which are experts in their own rights. And I'm really looking forward to having it moderated by Tiffany Ward. A little bit of a background, this is part of Greenfest, which is Montgomery County's largest environmental festival, one of Maryland's largest. Typically it's a one-day event, but this year we have taken it virtual and offering a lot of different events throughout the month of April. So let's get started here. I'd like to introduce Tiffany Ward. Tiffany is the moderator for tonight's discussion. She's also the very first Chief Equity Officer, which is a new position for Montgomery County here in Maryland. Tiffany is responsible for carrying out the county's racial equity and social justice initiative and collaborates very closely with agency leaders in the county government. Tiffany worked as a legislative aide on the county council and Mark Elrich's offices from 2007 to 2018. She also founded the team program at the Kingman Boys and Girls Club in Washington, D.C., which provides recreational and work opportunities for students 5 to 18. With that, I'll hand it over to Tiffany. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, Jason, for inviting me to moderate tonight. As I guess we start the night, I was debating as to whether or not we should speak to the historic verdict we just heard in the case of Mr. Chauvin and the killing of George Floyd. I will say the past year has definitely been, we've been weighted in the COVID pandemic, but also definitely impacted by the murder of George Floyd and how much that has illustrated the racial inequities that we have in this country, both through our health disparities and through our social justice and criminal justice disparities. Today is definitely an emotional and historic day for folks. And I think, quite frankly, I'm still digesting, but I definitely think it's important that we acknowledge not just today, but the time that we are living in, the constant angst around the racial injustice in many different spaces and cutting across issue areas. And it is my pleasure to introduce our panelists today. I want to thank them for joining us. Today, we have Tim Paule and Nicole Lindsey. Tim and Nicole are the co-founders of Detroit Hives. Detroit Hives works to create sustainable communities and bee populations by transforming vacant lots into pollinator-friendly spaces. They sell their products to local businesses and work with public schools to educate communities of color on the importance of sustainability. Next, we have Fred Tutman. Fred Tutman has been the Patuxent Riverkeeper with the Waterkeeper Alliance for the past 17 years. He's focused on activating communities and empowering people to defend their water. Fred's family has farmed the land neighboring the river for generations, growing tobacco. Then we have Rozina Kanchwala. I'm proud of myself, got that one right, I think. Rozina is the founder and executive director of EcoLogic, and they provide environmental education and programming focused on the climate crisis. She also serves as the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Manager for the Clean Energy Leadership Institute in Washington, D.C. And last but certainly not least is Pablo Blank. Pablo is the Director of Immigrant Integration at CASA of Maryland. Pablo is a director, during his tenure at CASA, he has helped over 6,000 people become US citizens and has led legal battles to protect immigrants in the DC metro area. Pablo has also served on the Board of Conservation Montgomery since 2012 and has advocated local victories such as protecting 10 Mile Creek and educating county residents on environmental issues. Again, thank you to our panelists. And I just want to start by giving them just a few minutes to talk about themselves, give us an idea and context of the work they do, and why they've decided to join us here tonight. And I will start with Tim and Nicole.
Thank you, Tiffany, for that wonderful introduction. and thank you guys for having us today. Definitely want to shed on the light that we're doing and the work that we love and we're passionate about. But it all started from seeing an issue in the city of Detroit with vacant lots and trying to find ways to change the narrative, what people thought about the inner city community, but those people that resided within those communities. And looking for ways to once again reimagine vacant lots and reinvest in our community to provide a triple bottom line solution, a social, environmental, and financial impact in our communities.
Yeah, so we want to be the change agents within our community. There was so much that was going on downtown that they were leaving out our neighborhood communities. And so us as native Detroiters, we want to take a hand in making a change within our own city.
Yep.
All right. Thank you, Tim Nicole. Fred.
Thank you. So I started Patuxent Riverkeeper about 17 years ago. We're part of an international movement of waterkeepers who are all grassroots activists. Our work is largely mentoring local activism surrounding water for the most part, but we work broadly on environmental issues. In Maryland, I work on the state's longest and deepest intrastate river. The Patuxent starts and ends in Maryland. So in theory, we ought to be able to fix this river that has a D- and a rather interesting history of activism. It is probably the most activist river in the history of Maryland, which is why it is the only river in the state that has its own river commission. So our work takes us into where the worst problems are to be found in the Patuxent watershed, which naturally takes us into some of the places where most environmentalists don't go, mobile home parks and people of color neighborhoods and places where injustices are actually quite rampant. We treat most transactions over the environment as injustices. Economic injustices, for the most part, perpetrated on people who have less by people who have more. So I'll leave it there for now.
Okay, thank you.
All right, I'll go next. So hi, thank you so much for having me. So I guess my interest in the field really started from a young age. I grew up Pakistani American, so we took a trip to Pakistan at a young age and really just, saw up close the problem of waste management in that country. And, here it's also such a big problem that I came to learn about and just really started thinking a lot about our consumer-driven lifestyle and the waste problem that we have here. I actually studied international studies in college, and that took me abroad. Following college, I actually spent a year in India, where I really saw, up close the human face of climate change. So I was studying agrarian distress, which in India is a nice way to say farmer suicides. And it was this, layering of issues. So, there was informal money lender debt, there was seed companies, pesticide companies taking advantage of these farmers, and climate change causing droughts or unpredictable weather patterns. And it led to this very depressing situation of farmers, just having no hope left. And so I think that was really, seeing climate change firsthand, the human face of it. When I came back to this country, I worked in the solar energy field, looking a lot at energy access and who is able to, use solar technologies, because it isn't available to all communities. So I was working at Grid Alternatives at the time, and really working to make solar available to all communities, as well as job training opportunities available to all communities. And then at some point, I also organized a high school camp for around environmental issues, but really made it personal. So taught kids about a local issue. I was in San Antonio at the time, and the students went to city council. They had speeches that they delivered, and it was just such an amazing experience to see students learn how to get involved in the democratic process, because that was something I didn't learn until much later on. So to be able to see these kids kind of get involved in a local movement that impacted them and find that they had a voice in this issue was really cool. And more recently, I wrote a play, produced a play. It was a climate comedy. And that just showed me that there really is an appetite for climate education that is entertaining, educational, and moves people to action. So it was sort of with all of these experiences that I recently founded EcoLogic. So actually 3 days ago, we received our 501(c)(3) status a year ago. So we've been a nonprofit much longer, but officially for a year. So excited to continue to work under the nonprofit and just provide environmental education and really work to make the movement more inclusive. So that's a little bit about me.
Thank you. Thank you. Pablo, it's your turn.
Thank you, Tiffany, and thank you, Montgomery Parks, the Green Fest, and Jason for inviting me to this panel. I have always been interested in environmental causes, but the urgency came from when I became a father. When I became a father, I started thinking, okay, what is the life that my daughter will have 30 years from now, 40 years from now, or 20 years from now? Will she be able to take a shower every day or no? Will she be able to drink water or no? So from that moment, my urgency came and I started volunteering for a Latino organization first called Granito de Arena. And then I became a member of the board of Conservation Montgomery, where I have been involved in causes, in conservation causes, defending creeks, trees from disaster, through education and some advocacy. But it is more and more evident that conservation causes is probably not enough, that big and bold actions are needed if we want to save the planet, the only planet that we have to live, at least for now, right? So additionally, people all around the world are suffering from different environmental disasters, suffering from displacement and moving all the world around. So floods, tornadoes, droughts, hurricanes makes people move from one country to another country many times. And that is how many Latinos came to the US, many Africans came to the US, and many Asians came to the US because of environmental causes in many, many cases. So that is where immigration and environmental justice become the two sides of the same coin. So this environmental justice component is very, very important, and we are little by little starting to play a role here. Latinos are usually called for, I would say, cleaning creeks, recycle, educating Latinos for recycle, but we are not usually, I would say Latinos and immigrants in general, right? We are not usually invited to the table where the big decisions need to be made. And that is where we should organize and we should become more active, demanding demanding a chair on the table. So these decisions, for example, you know that Latinos suffer from the highest rates of asthma, and that is an environmental cause, and also as an environment brings environmental consequences, and that is a quality of life. That is a lot of things, right? So also the neighborhoods where Latinos and immigrant lives have usually lower tree canopy, or again a lower quality of life. So this is why I became involved in environmental causes, and how I am little by little moving from from conservation education to organizing and becoming or asking for a place in the tables for making the big decisions. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Actually, Pablo kind of gave us a lead into my first question for the group. And I think I will start with Fred, but after Fred is done, anyone who wants to speak to this should. And the question is, or rather the request is that you talk to us a little bit about the intersection of racial justice and environmental justice. Like I said, Pablo kind of spoke to it a little bit, but Fred, if you would speak to us just a little bit about the intersection between racial justice and what we're calling environmental justice today.
Well, I'm glad you called it a little bit, because it's a pretty vast.
It's huge, it's huge. And I can, go ahead.
So it so happens at the moment, I'm the only African-American waterkeeper in America, 350 waterkeepers worldwide. We're working to change that, but I believe the reason that it's difficult for us to attract people of color to these movements is because typically the green movement is kind of tone deaf to our reality, and we struggle fundamentally to be ourselves in these movements. I operate in a very odd sphere where I'm a part of an international movement, but I operate kind of in my own universe because most of my peers are really focused on where the money is in these watersheds, to be honest, where the restoration grants are, where the not so serious problems are. And we actually have a complete opposite and inverted paradigm. We think the way you clean up a watershed is you start where the worst problems are. And then those other problems don't seem nearly as severe. But your question is really about race and racism. Truly, I believe the environment has become claimed space for whites. The belief that they're the prime environmentalists and the rest of us get to be diversity, stand by, watch, applaud, give them awards, send checks, whatever, which is shocking when you consider the depth of connectivity that we people of color have to the environment. The truth is we've been boycotting these movements for years because they don't care about us. We're afterthoughts. We're an asterisk in these movements. And I don't think people get that. They keep on trying to educate us and attract us in various ways. So we've got a tall climb ahead of us in order for us to pursue the environmental problems that particularly affect communities of color. So I think I answered your question in an oblique way.
Yeah, no. You've done just like you intended. Let's see, Pablo, could you speak to the intersection of racial justice and environmental justice? I think you're on mute.
Sorry for that.
That's all right.
I agree with Fred. I think that so we are suffering the consequences, right? So we people of color are suffering from the consequences of a economic system that put money before people, an economic system that is based on using the natures to satisfy our needs without any kind of restrictions. So, and we are usually suffering the consequences with probably not access to any benefits, right? So at this time, I think that is very, very important that we people of color act very bold in demanding our space in the table, because the decisions that will have to be made to balance the nature in the next decades will also impact us. So we want equity on that decision. We don't want to pay for all the bad things that have happened in the last 50 or 60 years, and now again pay for the next 30 years for the consequences of those things. So I agree with Fred that many times we are not being invited to the table, or we are being invited to small tables around, but never to the main table, right? So, and that is, from equity perspective, they should give us a chair in the table, but also we need to want it. So both things are very important.
Yep. Tim and Nicole, do you guys want to speak to this question at all? Well, you can speak to us about food security if you would like, but yeah, if you have any thoughts on this, I'd love to hear them.
I think Nicole and I would go back and forth. Before we dive into I think our challenges as it relates to racial injustice and environmental injustice, let's first talk about Africanized bees, killer bees. They're labeled as threats to our society, but they're just a product of their environment. The reason why they're so territorial or so defensive is because for millions of years, they've been exposed to many types of threats, like the honey badger, etc. So just like they're very similar to like many people of color in certain environments, whether it's poverty or dealing with a lot of racial injustice. Over time, you just become a product of your environment. But what people don't realize is that honeybees originate from Africa. And as people began to travel to Africa, they discovered honey, and that led them into discovering honeybees. And people want to take honeybees back to their respective places. But this couldn't happen without a fight. So some got away and some they were able to keep. The ones that got away, they were labeled as killer bees, a threat to society. And the ones that they were able to keep, they created a hybrid. They were able to alter their DNA, and they were able to create different type of races of bees, from Russian to European to Italian to Saccatraz to colonial, even Caucasian bees. And the most docile honeybees that you can keep are or will be the Italians. The most aggressive ones that you can keep or try to keep are the Africanized. And the differences between the most aggressive Africanized bees is that they last longer. Their DNA strands are able to fight off any type of threat, opposed to the European, Caucasian, or I'm sorry, Italian type of honeybees. So Africanized honeybees aren't dealing with the same type of threat or issues with as opposed to European or Italian. And it's because, like I said, they're missing that natural DNA that's been altered. So what some beekeepers are doing in Texas and other various places, they're starting to mix a little bit of Africanized strand or Russian strand that has a little bit of Africanized DNA, and they're crossbreeding their bees so they can be a little bit more mite resistant and a little bit more defensive so they can fight off their hives. Now, as we talk about that, let's also talk about how media always portrays pests or insects as a nuisance to our society. When you see a bug, you need to spray it, you need to get rid of it. You got these really ugly faces of insects, and try to make sure that insects do not belong in our environment or our surroundings. That same thing is what a lot of our ancestors had to deal with, whether you had colored or whether you had, for people of white people can use these type of water fountains. Media played a huge role in trying to subconsciously or consciously plant an image into people's minds that people of color were animals, that we were savages, that we were like pests or like killer bees, so to speak. So those are the things that always kind of play on our minds that we got to be conscious of. Now, as it relates to beekeeping here in Michigan, our experiences has been bittersweet. We had some great moments and we had some bitter moments. To be quite frank and transparent with you, my very first encounter with learning about beekeeping, I had to experience a lot of personal racism. I was viewed as a threat, and a lot of our mentors really didn't want to teach us any further, or they didn't really want to really help us at all. They and I'm not sure if this was in their perception of this being a trend, if they didn't perceive this to be serious, but Frank called me a threat. So I thought that was one of the things where they see me as a competition. Whereas all we wanted to do is transform our own vacant lots. We was in our own communities. We weren't trying to take anybody's model. We create something that didn't exist. Now, we also attend beekeeping associations. We also are members of several clubs. And 9 times out of 10, Nicole and I are probably the minority. We're always the minority in those type of events. You don't see too many people of color. And this is because sometimes beekeeping may not be of interest to most people of color, but 2, a lot of these events are not as inviting. They're not as welcoming. And this is because a lot of beekeepers predominantly are white male that's over the age of 60, and many may lack social skills with how to deal with someone of my background. Many may just not be familiar with dealing with people of color, and some may be racially biased.
Right.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you. And lastly, Rozina, do you need me to repeat the question? Speak to the intersection of racial justice and environmental justice.
Sure. Well, first of all, that was such a fascinating
an incredible education, right?
So yeah, thank you for that. That was amazing. You know, I will just say, I kind of want to echo some of what Fred and Pablo had mentioned, and just kind of highlight that the reason that we're in a climate crisis is because of largely the environmental movements, you know, racist history. So kind of if you look at the environmental movement, there was a lot of prioritizing the protection of public lands because they were for the enjoyment of white people, rather than looking at these polluting power plants that were in communities of color. And so had the focus been on these urban communities that were experiencing that were sacrifice zones, right? And so those same communities are the ones that have the higher rates of asthma, have the higher rates of cancer. Had the environmental movement rallied behind those communities rather than public lands, which actually were indigenous lands, I don't think we would have been necessarily in the situation that we're in right now. So I think we really need to think about that. And I think that really is a call to the environmental movement, which I will say I think has gotten better, but there's still a lot of work that needs to be done, including in the clean energy movement. When we think about, where are these minerals coming from that are used for these electric vehicles, for these solar panels, like what communities are impacted? And I think we just need to hold the environmental movement, the clean energy industry to a higher standard, but just recognize kind of the racist roots that have created the situation where we are today. Because had those polluting plants been in affluent white communities, I don't think that the chemical plants, the power plants, the oil and gas industry would have continued to get away with what they've been able to do. So that's what I'll add.
That's quite an addition. Thank you all for that. I have a follow-up, and this is kind of following up on Fred's first answer, and that is, does environmental activism look different in communities of color than it does for white populations, right? So I think, as a chief equity officer this past year, I've been asked a lot about how to pull people of color into this work. And so one of the first things I say is, one, you have to give credit to these communities. They've been doing this work, right? They may not call it what you call it. They may use it in another language, but communities of color have been doing this work. So how does environmental activism look different in communities of color? Or do you think it does than it does in the white population?
In any Black community that I've worked in, there's a fundamental understanding of the intersectionality between social justice and environmental blight, an absolute understanding that the lack of power follows these communities and that they have to use activist tactics. In wider movements, there's a presumption that if this was really useful work, someone would be providing a grant for it somewhere, and that these systems themselves are there to serve. And so I find the activism to be a little moderate, because the presumption is I can write my congressman, or I can use my insider status, or do various things to kind of get around it. But more importantly, there's no sense of the intersectionality between social justice. Most of the green movements I've seen that are activist movements are nature focused, not justice focused at all, actually. And as a nature focused movement, they largely protect privilege and amenities, hiking, backpacking, kayaking, and things that really require access and means, the very things that evade many people of color. We understand, as do people in women's rights, human rights, and any other kind of struggle-based movements, that we have to struggle and change these systems, these very same systems that fund, in many instances, these wider institutions that don't really have much interest in working in Black and brown communities because they think there's not much environment there to protect, quite frankly. That's the thing we have to overcome more often than not, is that we have to struggle to get clean water. These other movements work 9 to 5, apply for it, have various workarounds that they can do, but they don't necessarily share that power with Black and brown communities. And that's problematic. These are different movements. The people who want to get funded by the polluters versus the people who want to make them pay reparations, those are totally different movements. And I don't think people understand that. They simply assume that if everyone wants clean water, that's the same movement. I guarantee you it's not.
Ooh, thanks for speaking to that. Rozina, you're up next, and then Pablo. I see Pablo itching. I'm getting to you, Pablo.
No, I usually put the difference. I usually say that there are people who come to the environmental fight because of their professions, and are people who comes to this because of their needs. So there are people who really need an improvement in their environment, in their local environment, because they are dying, right? So asthma and many other things, they are dying because of that. There are other people who just want to believe that it would be great. Others has the urgency for it should be great, right? So it should be improved. I believe that sometimes that is the difference, and also I think that as Fred says, there is a different approach of what should be conserved, right? So should we keep this clean because it's nice to walk, or because we need the water, because if not, I cannot pay a bill of $20 a month to buy water in the supermarket. I need to drink the water that comes through the faucet, because I don't have the money to pay for water bottles. So that is many times the big difference between the two movements también. Also, needs versus profession, right? For me.
Okay, Rozina.
Yeah, I think I'll just add that I also think that there's an exposure issue, right? So I think that the media may highlight certain activists over others, and I think that that's important to also recognize. So, for instance, I know a woman, she's working on, she's a filmmaker putting together a movie of highlighting different BIPOC women in the outdoors. So I think, you know, sometimes there's this understanding of, you know, who's an environmentalist, but I think the media very much plays into that based on who they give the microphone and platform to. So, you know, yeah, I think that there just needs to be a better representation, really, of who's doing the work in the communities.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Who's called an environmentalist and who isn't recognized at all. Got you. Tim and Nicole.
Yes. So our grandparents, parents, they've been practicing sustainability for years. They didn't call it sustainability. They just been finding ways to save money, to practice ways to just, you know, just saving,
reuse and repurpose.
So this was like informed. We would see it. We would see our grandparents, you know, whether it's using jars or mason jars, and the jelly grape jars would be our drinking glasses. We would have plastic bags, some type of plastic bag stored somewhere. Like, why are we keeping all these plastic bags?
Or plastic containers we didn't use plenty of times. We didn't had the
Yeah, even the grease and the lard will be reused over and over and over again. We didn't really pay attention to it. We didn't have no fancy buzzwords. We just did whatever we can because we were saving. And sometimes this is saving to us, but on the outside, this was viewed as poverty. This is viewed as lower income, or it was frowned upon. Or you keeping that same jar, or you throwing away those, or you keeping that jars or plastic bags, etc. So that was always viewed as poverty for the outside looking in. Now, also, as this relates to nonprofit organizations, I think sometimes as it relates to those people doing great work, representing environmental justice, I think sometimes their work is overshadowed by larger organizations. And I think sometimes these larger organizations could sometimes hide their racial bias or racism through funds, through funding, through their board of directors. They have the funds, they have the right board to get all the right grants, they have the right resources, and they may be a competitive nonprofit that's doing the same kind of work, that may have the same type of, or I would say the same type of work, but the larger organization has a larger organization budget, they have a larger board, and they're more competitive, and they know all the other types of partners and sponsors. So they treat the other one as, oh, that's just a smaller collective, or that's a smaller type of organization. They have a smaller what's your operating budget? Are you operating under $1 million? Well, you can't really compete against this. Maybe you should partner with this larger one, or maybe you should go volunteer with this larger one. You know, maybe you should go work with this larger one. That would be best if you drop or denounce what you're doing as a co-founder, executive director, and go work for this larger one where it's a lot easier. Or, you know, maybe you could serve on their board. But I just think that a lot of those larger organizations sometimes use their power, their influence, to kind of overshadow those smaller organizations.
Yeah, and then also to add to that, I think with us creating our organization, representation is so important that it gives us an opportunity to connect with the youth or people our age, to kind of just open up their eyes, to invite them into a world that they've never been invited to. Because when they see us, they're like, hey, you know, I never thought about that. I never seen anyone who kind of looks like me within the community doing things that's environmental. So when we talk to students, a lot of times they don't think or view themselves as being environmentalists because they see other people that don't look like them. But when we come and we speak and we're showing them that we're doing the work and we're taking something out of nothing. And we're a community where we have like over 60,000 vacant lots. So now we're kind of taking this space that we have and inviting people back into nature.
And I think that Nicole hit it right on the head. What makes our organization so unique is that we're not from that background of studying 20 plus years of environmental sciences. We're not those people that you would expect to be a beekeeper or someone that's environmental science. We're those same people that were afraid of bees that most people can relate to. So our secret sauce is really the next generation. We're on a mission to inspire the next generation of leaders in sustainability. And a lot of times with older, larger organizations, they're not as flexible. They're not as, I would say, able to reach or be able to reach the next generation. They're kind of stuck in their same corporate structure where they lack how to reach the next generation. And I don't care how much money you have, I don't care how much resources you have, if you can't reach the next generation or inspire them, that's where you lose. So a lot of corporations are trying to find ways to make things engaging. They're trying to create cool social media, compelling ways or what have you, trying to mix things with rap. But if you don't have the sauce, you don't have the sauce.
Yeah, so we get asked a lot of times, how do you engage the youth on finding, engaging them about the environment and making it important to them? So we get that question all the time.
Can I piggyback on that? Because
course,
you
Fred.
triggered a chord there, because I know, because I travel around a lot, I give talks all over the country. And I know as the only Black Riverkeeper in this movement, in wider communities, there's a tendency to try and vet me. Do I know my stuff? Do I know what I'm talking about? Black communities generally embrace me, not only anywhere I go, but more importantly, no matter what watershed I'm in, I'm their Riverkeeper. And I think that's a very interesting phenomena that I think sometimes people don't quite get, that the symbolic value of seeing us do this stuff and to do it competently and for us to be leaders, not followers, is a very different phenomena that has very different significance in Blacker communities. And it's just a reality that I don't share with my white colleagues, frankly. It's something that would be very hard for them to understand how that works. You know, I go into communities way out of my turf and the people want me to run for mayor. It's flattering, but it also raises the bar. That's a point too, right? Because as a Black Riverkeeper, my nose, my sniffer is supposed to be a lot more acute on these things where whiter institutions are tone deaf. And so there really is a different set of expectations for me as a Black Riverkeeper as well.
Yeah, good point, Fred. Rozina or Pablo, do you want to speak to the issue of representation on, you know, as a person of color in your community and the benefits and burdens of that?
Well, I mean, I can say that, you know, Asian Americans, that is such a broad, diverse group, and it often is just lumped in as like, oh, the Asian American, right? And it's Asian Americans are incredibly diverse economically, from an education background, from a religious, cultural language. Like, you know, Asian Americans can root their, or, you know, countries of, or it's like 20 some countries. And so it's just incredibly diverse. And I think that, you know, in a sense it's just interesting, right? Like all these different communities have such different experiences, and yet like we're always sort of lumped together as one. And so it's just kind of challenging in a sense because you know, there is a lot of solidarity, and then there's also just this acknowledgement that there's all these differences within the communities. And I think that extends into environmental work, but just generally speaking as well, but definitely also in the environmental movement.
And that's why diversity is an unsatisfactory term. It doesn't tell us anything.
Right.
It's a label. It's only a label. And I don't know a single Black community saying we need more diversity. right? That's something that you have trouble with in top-down organizations, not in grassroots ones.
Yep.
So I love that phrase that says, nothing that is about me should be without me.
Nothing for me without me.
Yeah, so I think that is really, really important. So many times we are invited, but at the level that we cannot make the decisions. The program is already designed, everything is designed. It's like they need you only for the picture or to check a box or probably they have a bias that they don't realize, that they think that you are not able to provide value and provide feedback, right? So something that they can add that. And many times, I am also an activist in other different areas like culture or financial education and citizenship. And I found the same thing in every area, as Rozina was saying. It's not only environment, it's difficult. And African Americans are much. I admire the progress in the thinking that African Americans have about this when they talk about tokenism, right? So like decades before, we can speak about tokenism about Latinos. So there is a lot about that in the environmental movement too.
Okay. And that, of course, you all are good because you're leading to my next question. My next question is, are there any stereotypes or assumptions about the communities in which you work that prevent honest conversations and dialogue and quality roles for you and your community when you're talking about quality of life issues like health, the environment, and other issues that cut across?
Well, yeah, there's this presumption that we don't know about the environment, right?
Yeah.
That somehow, because we've rejected the existing leadership that's formed around these issues, that we must be ignorant of the environment. And then so we often have to rebut that presumption. And it's a struggle to get a word in edgewise. That's what I meant earlier when I said the environment is claimed space. The presumption is that wider organizations can go into any community, anywhere like a parachute drop and start telling people what to do with their local environment. I don't know any Black people who think that. Actually, our sense of domain doesn't usually extend that far. We're not so safe when we try and do that stuff. So there's a real disconnect, I think, between the need for these communities to self-govern and, quite frankly, what these bigger greens, whom are they actually speaking for? Okay, and then the last thing I'll say on this, I went to a meeting recently in Maryland where somebody got up and assured the Attorney General of the state that all the leading environmentalists were present in the room. And I didn't see another person of color anywhere in the room. So I know that Black people are optional in these movements. And that is what we have to change that if we really want inclusive movements. We're not going to go anywhere where we're a second party, second string, standing in the shadows. We can't be ourselves, can't say what's on our mind, and are expected to defer to the existing members. I don't really care if these organizations diversify or not, truthfully. I want them to stop pretending if they don't intend to, so we stop wasting our time trying to help them. I don't want to waste my time helping somebody that doesn't, but they need to admit that so we can move on. I won't hate them and I won't be mean to them, but I sure as heck want to spend my time working with groups that genuinely want to fix that problem, rather than just kind of make sure that they don't have any racism kind of clinging to them because, we put up a statement on the website and, we did something nice that was a freebie for some Black community somewhere, but it's not inherent. It's not in the DNA of the organization. I don't care if Sierra Club admitted John Muir was a racist. Everybody knew it. All they did was take control of the narrative. I want to know what they're going to do that's different. That's what I want to know.
Rozina, can I get you to respond to that question? Thank you, Fred.
Sure. So I guess, just building off of my previous comment, right? I think with Asian Americans, that's the community I'm a part of, so I'll speak to that. I think there is this model minority myth, and I think it's a myth, and I think it's actually really dangerous because I think as a result, a lot of Asian communities get ignored. And so here in Chicago, for instance, there's a Chicago Asian Americans for Environmental Justice group, right? And there's a community, and a lot of Chicago's Chinatown residents, they, grow their own produce from their homelands. And unfortunately, a lot of the soil is toxic because of the industrialization of these lower income communities on the southwest side of Chicago. And so there's very little in terms of, support, information, knowledge, resources that's being provided to these communities. This is just like one example. And I think that, this can be seen in so many communities. And I think often Asian American communities just get kind of left out of the conversation. And so I think that a lot of these, stereotypes and just classifications, these buckets are just not helpful. They're dangerous. And yeah, I think we just need to dig deeper and really understand what diversity is.
Yeah. Nicole and Tim.
Yeah, so the question is, are there any stereotypes or assumptions about your community that prevent honest conversations or dialogue about the quality of life, like health and the environment? I think as it relates to just even beekeepers, sometimes that a lot of predominantly white beekeepers or non-people of color, they see that this may be something where, or they're not even familiar with people of color being in the leading role of beekeeping. They think that this is something that's new to our culture that we're not familiar with, but sometimes you have to remind them about people like Dr. Charles Henry Turner, Dr. Shirley Ann Jackson, Dr. George Washington Carver, who are all, or even Benjamin Banneker, who are all beekeepers. Dr. Charles Henry Turner was the first African-American and scientist to discover that honeybees can see shape and color. And Dr. Shirley Ann Jackson, at a very early age, she used to play with bumblebees outside, but this led her into being the first Black graduate at MIT, but also inventing caller ID, the call waiting, and etc. But outside of that, I think as it relates to the stereotypes, I believe that there lies a systematic racial structure within our communities. There's definitely some racial type of separation. And when you think about the stereotypes of people of color are poorly educated, they lack medical coverage, they need jobs, or they're uneducated, it's all stemmed around how we're targeted in our communities. Once again, we have poor access to education, etc. And this is due to the lack of opportunities and resources that negatively impact our community residents, whereby we may see active violence, poor health choices in forms of food deserts, whether this is liquor stores, gas stations, fast food restaurants on every corner in the city, which is leading to heart disease, leading to poor mental health, depression, etc. We also see a lot of littering and dumping in our area. And a lot of these times it's not the community residents, it's large corporations or small businesses outside in suburban areas coming into our city, dumping because they think no one's going to care, no one's going to complain. And there's just so much blight that it just blends right on in. And I think also the root cause that a lot of this is just causing STD, depression, anxiety, and stress, and many unseen challenges. And it just looks and comes out in forms of violence, or it comes out in forms of poor health because you're depressed and you're just trying to find ways to deal with your depression. We don't have a lot of times the funds to go see the adequate medical or holistic doctor. We just do what we can to scratch and survive. And a lot of times people on the outside may see that as, oh, you're making poor health choices, or why you always in trouble, why you always doing this and that. But they're not seeing the challenges that we face day to day, from the vacant lots, from the poor education systems, for the poor food choices, and etc.
Yeah. And so the things that we need for the betterment of our health, our better food choices, are on the outskirts of the city. And so a lot of times people in our city don't have like the funds to pay for that type of food, or like Tim said, the medical care, or had a transportation to travel out in the suburbs to get quality foods. When Tim first got sick, he was, somebody told him about the power of local raw honey. And it was actually in a convenience store, or like how we call them, liquor stores, but it was in a suburban area where they had local raw honey from an actual beekeeper.
And I wasn't looking for local raw honey. It was an accident.
Yeah.
I just went into a liquor store, convenience store, a suburban. Suburban liquor stores have nuts, and they have different types of fruit. And this one had local raw honey from a beekeeper. And I was like, that's random, but the store owner recommended me trying it. And this would have never happened if I would have stopped at a liquor store close by my neighborhood. They would have had honey buns, a whole lot of high fructose corn syrup, aspartame, all type of artificial sweeteners that would contribute to the worsening of my health. So I just think that type of injustice lies within our community. So when they see us, when people see us where we may have poor health choices, a lot of these are just what we can afford. It's 99 cents, it's $1.99. It's there. It's local. It's convenient. It's right next door.
It's cheap.
It's cheap. It's not like going to a Target or or a Myers to get
Whole Foods.
exactly. And I know a lot of these things we can grow our own food, but that's also where we lost a lot of education on how to grow and sustain our own food. And we're trying to get back and educate our community, the next generation, how to sustain yourself, because that education was lost. And once again, that's due to a whole nother conversation on displacement and what happened to our people and losing our native language and culture and etc.
Yep. So we connect with community organizations that are actually growing fresh fruits and vegetables, and that's helping the community and teaching them how to grow their own food. But we're also providing pollination by partnering with them and placing hives on their community garden.
And whenever you have a hive partner with a community garden, or if you have cover crop near your community garden, you're guaranteed to see an increase in your yield. More flowers, more nectar and pollen, more fruits and vegetables for the community.
All right, thank you all. Pablo, the last for this question.
Thank you. I think that as a Latino and as an immigrant, I would say that stereotypes, there are several. One is language, but the one that I would like to discuss more today is this idea, oh, they don't come. They don't come. We don't. We are all here. All of us look alike because the others don't come. So that is a stereotype that and also is present in not only in the environment, is the system that we live here in the U.S., right? So the white supremacism that we live in. I think that you will never be able to get Latinos going and participating in one particular organization if you invite them to plant a tree and once a year. You cannot complain that Latinos will not show up. If you only want to plant a tree once a year, probably today, Earth Day, or something, or do some particular event, you need to commit. If you want for Latinos immigrants to show up, you need to commit, you need to build a bridge, you need to also invite them to join your causes, but also you have to move, use your legs and walk through the bridge and also join their causes as well, right? So it's not only environmental. We need to build trust, we need to build confidence, and that when Latinos and immigrants will show up in different organizations and events, etc. If you don't do that, if you only do one event for the picture, for one event to celebrate Hispanic Heritage Month, yeah. So you will always have the same people probably that will go to do the same picture every year, but you will not have participation. You will not have all the input and the brain and the power that a diverse population will provide to you.
All right, thank you guys. You guys have provided us with a great conversation today. I want to thank you for that. Believe it or not, we are coming to the end. So I'm going to ask you all to give me just, 1 minute, right? If we're wrapping up this discussion. So 1 minute that you want to talk about whatever you would like as we wrap up for the night. And we will start with, I'm going to start with Fred, and then go Rozina, Pablo, and Nicole and Tim. So closing remarks.
So there's a wealth of environmental knowledge, experience, and passion out here. If you had to hire it all, you couldn't possibly do it. There's no one ethnic group that's going to clean up this planet all by itself. We need everybody on deck, and these movements have to change. It's as simple as that. If they don't change, they're going to become extinct anyway, because the demographics are not going their way in this country. So we really have to help our whiter friends and colleagues find a way to deeper self-knowledge, because I think that's the key to more participation from people of color in these movements. And as Pablo pointed out, we need equity. We need to have a say. Equity doesn't mean we own the movement. It means that our point of view actually has weight. And so That's hugely important if we're going to have, frankly, if we're going to save the planet. These are serious stakes. And we've got a good product to sell, nature.
That's right. That's right. Rozina, your closing statement.
Well, I guess I will close with plugging a few EcoLogic events, if that's okay. We've got an environmental camp, Camp EcoLogic for middle and high schoolers coming up. It actually kicks off in 2 days and it takes place Thursday evenings for the next 6 Thursdays. So today is the last day to register. So if there are any middle or high schooler parents or teachers or students out there, check it out and sign up. But we also do a lot of community building. And so, you know, we have an eco yoga that we do twice a month. And it's really a way to ground ourselves in a yoga community and then chat about environmental topics on people's minds. And we've got a book and movie club and, you know, just looking for ways to reach out to people in you know, making the environmental movement a little bit more accessible. As I said at the beginning, we are very new and so open to ideas, open to collaborations. So definitely check us out and reach out, ecologicprograms.org. So thank you again so much for having me. And it's been amazing to be with these fellow panelists. I've learned so much. So thank you all.
Thank you. Pablo, your closing statement.
Thank you, Tiffany. I think that I would like to say the time is now. We don't have much time if we want to have a planet to live in few decades from now. So time is now and it takes a village. So we should all participate on this. There is no way, as Fred said, there is not one group cannot resolve the issue for everybody else. So we all are needed in the table. And if we don't have a say, then we are losing time because we will not accomplish much. And I also like this phrase: if you want to go fast, go by yourself. If you want to go far, let's go together, right? So we need to go together. So we need to walk all the way, and time is now to start. Thank you so much.
Yeah. And lastly, Tim and Nicole.
Yes, so we want to definitely share a few things, but the number one decline in all pollinators is the loss of habitat. We've done away with creating habitats for our insects. We displaced them and gentrified them. A lot of the insects, whether it's honeybees, pollinators, we created roads and highways in place of their habitats. We developed homes and communities. So what we want to do is find ways to restore those habitats for all living things. We should create biodiversity and inclusion.
And another thing is that everybody has a purpose on our earth. So we have to keep a hive mindset. And what I mean by that is that inside a honeybee colony, all the bees do their part for the greater good of the hive. So we have to come together and work on different areas for the greater good of this planet.
And again, we just want to thank Greenfest. The moderator did a wonderful job, Tiffany Ward. And thank you, Jason, for inviting us. And thank you, everyone, as well. Definitely appreciate it.
Thank you guys so much. This has been so enriching. I am so glad that we had this conversation. I now want to be a Waterkeeper. So Fred, I'll be reaching out to talk to you. And I'm just really enriched. I just want to thank you all so much for spending the time with us today. I want to thank Jason for inviting me. And of course, I want to thank the audience for joining us and for learning about this work. Thank you.
Thank you all so much for a wonderfully engaging conversation. We certainly appreciate it. And I'm really glad that we recorded all this because I can tell you I'm going to need to watch it a few times just to unpack a lot of what you folks brought up and talked about. There was a lot of deep stuff and I wish we had another few hours to go into even more detail. But thank you all so much for your time and your talent and your dedication to your work and to your communities. And thank you again, Tiffany, for all that you do for Montgomery County and for hosting and moderating tonight's call. Again, this is part of Greenfest, Montgomery County's environmental festival. This is the first movie in partnership with the DC Environmental Film Festival. We have a second film that we're also screening online called The Story of Plastic. We're going to have another film panel discussion next Tuesday. That's April 27th, same time. And all that information is up on the Greenfest website. We'll go ahead and email all of you a link to the recording. And thank you all so much. We hope you have a wonderful evening. Take care.
Thank you. Good night.